We are here tonight to consider one important aspect of the dazzling exhibition inspiring Walt Disney, the animation of French decorative arts, recently opened here at the Met and curated by our very own Burchard. The early critical reception has been hugely enthusiastic, and enormous crowds are waiting online to get in to visit the Disney exhibition. This is unquestionably the family holiday experience of the season. But it is, in my opinion, a misnomer and indeed a disservice to refer to this as the Disney exhibition. This exhibition and its accompanying catalog, which was also authored by Wolf, is very much about 18th century French decorative arts. And it is important that this aspect of the project is not lost in the Disney buzz. At the center of this project is the recognition of the implicit potential for the animation of every Rococo form, a stylistic characteristic that has come to define the period's style. The notion of the fanciful animation of the inanimate is not merely a formal characteristic, but actually pervades the cultural moment in 18th century France, evident in the fine and performing arts and in the literature of the period. And that is why I am so pleased to be part of this evening's conversation for which we have gathered 4 scholars of 18th century art history to speak to the ways in which this is manifest. For their support of the exhibition, I would like to extend our utmost gratitude to the lead corporate sponsor, Morgan Stanley. We are also grateful to the Florence Gould Foundation, the Danny Kaye and Sylvia Fine Kaye Foundation, French Heritage Society, and Beatrice Stern. Further thanks is owed to Diane W. and James E. Burke Fund, Irene Roosevelt Aitken, and Marilyn and Lawrence Friedland for making the extraordinary catalog possible. I also want to take a moment to thank Mariana Siciliano and Emma Wegner for organizing this evening's events under such unusual circumstances. But without further delay, I would like to introduce our evening speakers. Each will speak briefly, and then following, there will be a conversation among them. So our speakers this evening include Dr. Wolf Burchard, Associate Curator in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts here at the Met, and Curator of the exhibition that we are discussing. Dr. David Pullins is Associate Curator in the European Paintings Department at the Met, where he is in charge of 17th and 18th century French, Italian, and Spanish painting. Dr. Meredith Martin is a Professor of Art History at NYU, focusing on cross-cultural encounters in European art. She is also the founding editor of Journal 18, a journal of 18th century art and culture. And finally, Dr. Alicia Caticha is Professor of Art History at the University of Virginia, where she specializes in 18th century sculpture and the decorative arts, and on the intersection between aesthetic theory and artisanal production outside of the academic sphere. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker this evening, Wolf Burchard.
Thank you, Sarah. And good evening, or good afternoon, or late afternoon. I hope you can hear me all right. I would like to join you, Sarah, in welcoming tonight's speakers, Meredith Martin, Alicia Caticha, and David Pullins, and in thanking them for their time. So my name is Wolf Burchard, and I'm the curator of Inspiring Walt Disney, the Animation of French Decorative Arts. The exhibition, which opened on Friday, incites a conversation between 2 forms of artistic expression that may at first seem worlds apart. 18th century porcelain, furniture, and gilt bronzes made for the few, and 20th century animated films made for the many. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the release of Walt Disney's Beauty and the Beast, which comprises a triumvirate of supporting cast members, a candlestick, a clock, and a teapot, all of which were considered luxury goods in the mid-18th century when Beauty and the Beast was first published, as were the commodities associated with them, such as tea, candles, and, in more abstract terms, time. Be Our Guest, the film's musical number, records the generous hospitality of the enchanted household staff, which we evoke in the exhibition with a lavish display of a Sèvres porcelain dinner service. This display is meant to function as a reminder of the seductive power of these trappings of entertainment, which lent agency to what at first seems superfluous decorative objects. Indeed, the consumption of decorative luxury objects, such as porcelain teapots and gilt bronze candlesticks, precariously situated between greed and the just support of France's craftspeople was a central subject of discussions in the salons of enlightened Paris. The thriving commerce in luxury goods, so the argument ran, benefited the wider public because the ever-growing demand ensured employment for craftsmen and merchants alike. Voltaire himself famously provided cover for the Parisian elites reveling in the purchase of porcelain, furnishings, and fashion, the superfluous, a very necessary thing, as he put in his 1736 satirical poem, The Worldling. Voltaire's contemporary, Gabrielle Suzanne Barbeau de Villeneuve, author of the original 1740 Beauty and the Beast, highlighted the beguiling powers of luxury and decoration in her description of the Beast's castle. Furnished with staircases of agate and golden banisters, porphyry dining tables, and every night the female lead character, named Belle in Disney's version, dreams of shopping sprees across Paris. In Disney's version of the tale, the castle quite literally takes center stage, functioning as a visual reflection of the Beast's gradually mellowing character. I quote, I hope you'll forgive me, "As you can see, the pseudo-facade was stripped away to reveal the minimalist Rococo design. This is yet another example of the late neoclassical Baroque period, and as I always say, if it's not Baroque, don't fix it." This thus resounds Cogsworth's feeble attempt to lighten up his dry guided tour through the Beast's castle, having long lost Belle's attention and indeed that of the viewer. Of course, this incomprehensible string of stylistic terms makes no sense whatsoever, but then neither, one might argue, do the combinations of Gothic, Baroque, and neoclassical forms in and outside the Beast's castle. Another pun associated with Beauty and the Beast, which I completely overlooked in the making of this exhibition, is the antagonist Gaston's catchy chant, "I use antlers in all of my decorating." Prompted by this miniature chair you can see here, and it really is tiny, several people I showed around the exhibition cited Gaston's song. This included one Disney animator, one Met Museum trustee, and one university professor, Roland Betancourt, who teaches art history at the University of California in Irvine. He said it made him think of the juxtaposition of the Beast's and Gaston's spaces. If Gaston's hunting obsession kills the animate, the Beast's realm animates the inanimate. And also the sense that the household objects are basically asleep until Belle arrives speaks to the importance of the domestic use that lends these objects animacy. Now let's go back to the 18th century. Rococo artists identified an array of methods to animate their inanimate works. In the exhibition, we have Juste-Aurèle Meissonnier's famous gilt bronze candlestick, which evokes motion through sinuous curves borrowed from shells and vegetation that carry the eye across a complicated asymmetrical surface reminiscent of abstract sculpture. Meissonnier's contemporary and biographer, the Comte de Caylus, animated the inanimate in his ballet, The Teapot Prince, in which, as Meredith will soon have you discover, a prince is in fact turned into a teapot. Caylus' ballet demonstrated a rich exchange between decorative and performing arts and presaged Walt Disney's Silly Symphonies, The Clock Store, and The China Shop, released 2 centuries later. Caylus' close friend, Proper Joliot de Crébillon, in turn, wrote one of the most popular novels of the 18th century, The Sofa, A Moral Tale, in which a man is punished for his poor behavior by being turned into a piece of upholstered furniture. It is the subject of David's talk. We have an early edition of the book in the exhibition, and indeed in contemporaneous Sofa. Last weekend, a security guard told me he could have sworn that at night he saw the sofa walk through the exhibition. Still not quite sure whether or not he was joking, but what the security guard did is something that we all do, consciously and subconsciously. We anthropomorphize. We attribute human properties to non-human entities, often without even realizing it. This, of course, is reflected in the terminology that we use to describe furniture and decorative works of art. Chairs and sofas have arms, backs, and legs. Teapots have bellies and shoulders, candlesticks have arms, and clocks, of course, have faces. Anthropomorphisms are essential to the shared aim of Disney and Rococo artists to create the illusion of life, and they're usually employed with zest, fantasy, and wit. Now, I'm no Disney animator or Rococo artisan, but I can relate to their shared ambition. Indeed, one of the principal objectives of today's museum curators is to breathe life into the collections under their care and to help those objects tell their stories. Some objects were once personal belongings to whom a single individual developed a close emotional attachment. Others were witnesses or direct products of some of the most significant chapters in the history of civilization, and most of them have multiple biographies and several stories to tell. We have one life, they have many lives, to use Neil McGregor's words. The poster child of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's first exhibition devoted to Walt Disney is a Sèvres porcelain tower vase, of which the fantastical architecture foreshadows Disneyland's Sleeping Beauty castle by almost 2 centuries. Only 2 pairs of the peculiar yet highly sophisticated tower vases were produced. A pink pair, now in the collection of the Huntington Art Museum in Pasadena, and a green one in the Met's collection. Made around 1762, the 4 vases are being reunited in the exhibition, probably for the first time in 250 years. They have received a lot of attention on Instagram. My favorite comment is that of "breaking is bad," which seems to be the handle of the head of ceramics at Christie's. She called our display the best final note of an exhibition ever. Now, as you can imagine, that obviously made my heart jump. To this day, there remain some gaps in the provenance of those vases. If only these objects could speak, what would they say? And what would they say to each other? Fancy seeing you here. Where were you during the French Revolution? When did you come to America? It is conceivable that the vases last saw each other at Versailles in April 1763 during one of the regular sales organized by Sèvres and usually attended by the French king himself. One wonders how the vases now feel about being reunited in front of the first bird's-eye view of Disneyland. Because we tend to associate provenance with grand surnames and distinguished collections, one is compelled to imagine a rather snooty exchange between the vases, not helped by the fact that the pink pair was sold on the spot, while the green vases remained in the manufacturer's inventory of unsold stock for at least another decade. The tower vases are thought to have been designed by Étienne Maurice Falconet, the French sculptor and Royal Academician widely known for his menacing Cupid, a work that quite literally seems to whisper to us, and which made a cameo appearance in Fragonard's The Swing, which, in turn, as the exhibition reveals, repeatedly served as a source of inspiration for Disney animators. Falconet was appointed director of sculpture at Sèvres in 1757 and is the subject of Alicia's talk. As we will see, many of his marble creations were translated into the new medium of soft-paced biscuit porcelain. The magic lantern is the first such object from the Met's collection that visitors clap eyes on when touring the Disney exhibition. And I'm now conscious of the fact that I shouldn't call it the Disney exhibition, but anyway. It was part of a series of so-called Boucher and Falconet children made at Vincennes and Sèvres, of which some of the earliest examples were supplied to Louis XV with the aim of enlivening the king's table with charmingly sentimental conversation pieces. Depicting a camera obscura, the roots of cartoons and cinema, the magic lantern also captures the childlike wonder of storytelling upon which Disney's empire was built. Falconet's gentle rendering of the youthful spectators conveys their focused awe as well as their willingness to block out their surroundings and let their imagination run free. One of the main themes of the Met's exhibition. That children perceive the world differently from adults was a subject of great fascination amongst mid-18th-century philosophers like Rousseau and Voltaire, who took a keen interest in the psychological differences between childhood and adulthood and concluded that children were not just miniature versions of adults. Walt Disney was equally fascinated with children's perception of the world and encouraged his mature viewers to adopt some of the innocence that allows the young to believe truly in the magic of fairy tales, an encouragement that we are trying to echo in the exhibition. Walt Disney's animation and his perspective on the visual arts aroused the curiosity of some of the liveliest intellects of his day. He famously said, "I make pictures for entertainment, and then the professors tell me what they mean." Would the Sèvres craftspeople express similar sentiments when confronted with recent interpretations of their work? One can but speculate about their artistic motivation, for like their ceramics, these makers remain predominantly silent, having left no records akin to the lively debates held at the French Royal Academies of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture. As Katie Scott explains, I quote, "If there was no textual defense of decoration in the 18th century, it is precisely because its authors belonged, in a very real sense, to the non-literate world of work." I would argue that objects such as the tower vases were made with one very simple goal, giving their audience pleasure, possibly helping them escape, albeit for a brief moment, the tribulations of ordinary life. Through magic, beguilement, sometimes even contemplation. And maybe by initiating a dialogue between the vases and Disney's architectural fantasies on the walls surrounding them, we can bring these objects back to life again. The Metropolitan Museum looks back at a long tradition devoted to this quest. Famously, upon his appointment as the museum's new director in 1967, Thomas Hoving received the brief from New York's then mayor John Lindsay to make the mummies dance. Half a century later, it may be the turn of the decorative arts. Thank you. And I'm now going to lose my pen and give it over to David.
Thank you so much, Wolf, and thank you to Wolf and Sarah for inviting me to be a kind of interloper at moments in the generation of such an exciting exhibition that really changes how we look at a whole host of material, which we're just touching on this evening. So I was asked to speak about this really peculiar but wildly important in its moment publication. In 1742, just 2 years, as you've heard, after the publication of Beauty and the Beast, Paris went wild for a series of short stories that appeared under this title, The Sofa, A Moral Tale. It was authored by the popular libertine writer Crébillon Fils. Its unlikely protagonist, and the only real link actually across 20 exoticized tales, was named Amanzé. He's a young man condemned to be forever reincarnated as a sofa. This conceit allowed for a voyeuristic lens into the boudoirs of various women, from the most highly born to the most humble. The spectacular transfiguration, or apotheosis maybe, of Amanzé the sofa, the title and object become one, or the name of him, the character and object become one, that apotheosis is illustrated here in the frontispiece to a later edition from 1774. By the century's end, the story had gone through multiple editions and translations across Europe, including 18 editions in English alone. The Sofa, this book, points to key issues in the life of objects at the intersection of popular culture, commodity culture, and the public sphere as it took shape. Novels themselves, the actual text of a book, were still a new thing in Europe. Hence the link of these words, novelty and novel, and formats themselves, how they should take shape, were still being worked out. And the Sofa's narrative structure, this prolonged series of stories that worked through just an additive structure of adding episodes or nuggets in an exoticized setting, were actually both inspired by 1001 Nights, and now still more famous series of stories, which had first been published and translated into French 40 years prior. That non-European context is apparent in the character names, as you've just heard, the costumes that you see here on this frontispiece, and the fictitious place of publication, Peking, which was a way to get around censorship issues by giving a completely ridiculous, totally improbable location. But in other this also points to the fact that Near and Far East were often conflated and unproblematically conflated during this period. The sofa's focus on an object telling the story was an additional bid at novelty and partook in what literary historians now call, as you've heard a moment ago, it narratives, a term that refers to books that take up an object, a noun, a thing, sometimes an animal, and tell the story from that point of view and its travels. In 1781, a London critic complained, quote, "This mode, what we now call the it narrative, of making up a book and styling it as the adventures of a cat, a dog, a monkey, a hackney coach, a louse, a shilling, a rupee, or anything else for that matter, is grown so fashionable now that few months pass which do not bring one of them under our inspection." Part of Crébillon's particular brilliance in this larger story was to latch not onto any piece of furniture or any object, but a very controversial newcomer to the home. It may be difficult, and I think is indeed difficult for us to imagine that today, especially perhaps as many of you watch this evening from your sofas at home, that this was an object with a foreign ring that carried meanings that were electric, even potentially inappropriate. As the art historian Mimi Hellman has brilliantly argued, furniture has a way of disciplining or structuring the body's movements, above all in relationship to social decorum. With the sofa, however, it was an invitation to instead relax decorum that made it the object of such fascination. If we were to believe newspapers and cultural commentators in this period about how it impacted French society, sofas were, in a sense, already acting, moving in an animate kind of sense across bodies of Paris. They were acting on all fashionable Parisians in this period. While the chair on the left, these are two fashion prints from the end of the 17th century, the chair on the left leaves the occupant respectably upright. The sofa, by contrast, allows the woman to start to lean. Late 17th century fashion plates gives you the sense of a relaxed posture and even lifted legs, completely verboten to women in particular, that early sofas encouraged. The progress made with upholstery, too, was relevant and resulted in an inviting kind of platform. I really like this print on the left in particular for the way that these pillows, a kind of incidental thing, suggest an invitation for this woman in her rigid, probably bone-stayed dress to consider succumbing to its invitation to recline. You may be surprised to learn that as a piece of furniture, the sofa's origins actually remain still rather hotly debated in Europe. There is no question, however, that for Crébillon and his contemporaries, they saw it as an exoticized foreign object, specifically one from the Near East. Hence the author's exoticized setting and characters. In particular, it evoked the harem, spaces hidden from men, but in which women were believed to lounge in distracted abandon, and the incitation for endless erotic imagined tales. Historically, the built-in architectural furniture encountered in places like Constantinople, today's Istanbul, such as you see there on the left, provided fodder for this connection to a piece of seat furniture. This is Amanzé, the character's kind of voyeuristic access to spaces and bodies that he should have never had the privilege of seeing, and in effect, because he was a sofa, of touching. Sofas, then, were surprisingly steamy pieces of furniture, the ideal point of view for certain readers, and presumably Crébillon fils was writing with a heterosexual male audience as his primary target. The sofa you've seen, which is in the exhibition, is such a fantastic example. We encounter such an object then, and we look at it as, I hope, a highly charged kind of cultural object, one that asks its occupants to abandon upright and uptight kind of positions, and to enjoy its comforts. And, as the name of this particular furniture model suggests, even travel vicariously from Paris to the Near East. And as Wolf has pointed out, this anthropomorphic language with which we describe furniture seems so fitting here, the gently bent legs, the arms that embrace, the back curvaceous and undulating. One of the wonderful things about the translation of 18th century French visual culture in the world of Walt Disney, as you'll see in this exhibition, is not only its potential for fantasy or travel from home, but more particularly for never asking us to assume that it's a one-to-one reportage on the past. When painters and draftsmen in the 18th century portrayed interiors, they, too, were not simply giving us a transparent document about historic furnishings or taste, but in the most creative and best kinds of minds, they were productively engaging with these objects' cultural meanings. Objects are, for them, actors in a painting such as this. In the 1720s, the painter of these works, Jean-François de Troyes, pioneered a new genre of painting that became known as tableaux de mode, or pictures of fashionable contemporary life. They were remarkable for depicting contemporary society and etiquette. This is a really new thing for this period. And in paintings such as these, an artist like de Troyes rallies furniture and decoration to support libertine literature's amorous and narrative ends. In the painting on the right, the woman lifts up her skirt, ostensibly to fix her garter. It's titled The Garter, but the nude bronze sculpture on the table reveals what her day dress hides. Meanwhile, the clock is a documented signed model and other works by Charles Boulle, a cabinet maker designer whose works you will see in the exhibition. But here in the details, the ormolu mounts of that object, Father Time's scythe has been stolen by a victorious Cupid who's there up at the top. So he's removed his Father Time's scythe, allowing time to stop, at least momentarily, for the couple. Below, in the cabinet, absolutely minute but precise titles and lettering run across the books, indicating that these themselves are examples of the light, libertine kinds of genre of writing of the sofa itself. And the book that the woman has set aside on the pier table, that too is presumably of the same kind of writing, suggesting she's fully aware of the kind of narratives and objects in the space that she finds herself kind of in real life, as imagined by de Troyes. The pendant, called the Declaration of Love, mobilizes the sofa as a theme, an actor in a story that helps move the narrative along. Not unlike the print that you've seen before, here a luxurious Indian calico pillow props up one arm, while the other is taken by the man who rests on bended knee. The excited lapdog suggests how etiquette is disciplining the man's advances, but the surrounding furniture all encourages a narrative of seduction. At the simplest, the division of the armchair that you've seen in earlier prints is nowhere to be found, while the rhyming of forms, the interwoven curving lines of the sofa as it meets the wall paneling, the paneling as it meets the frame of the picture, a picture in a picture, the ormolu-mounted vase, all of these suggest a union of forms or bodies. Connection rather than division would be the guiding principle. The print at right, one of the most advanced designs by Messonnier, whose candlestick design you saw earlier. This extrapolates this formal logic of mixing materials through curvaceous lines and framing devices. Of course, the scene to unfold is anticipated, albeit with the modesty of a mythological guise, in the little vignette there in the background, which depicts Mars and Venus. The setting, in effect, colludes in the seduction, providing us with the next frame in a cinematic sequence of events. Fueled in large part by libertine literature that made the public aware of the many ways that decor and inanimate objects might aid in telling a story, in the wake of the sofa, furniture remained a key actor. The most famous of those, perhaps, at the time was Bastide's La Petite Maison from 1758, in which an entire house colludes to eventually seduce, or perhaps more accurately, to wear down a woman's initial advances, or her resistance to a man's advances. This is a similar kind of active entire world, entire decor that is evident in Beauty and the Beast. In a story titled Thermidor from 1744, a young male narrator finds himself in a small cabinet with two women. Quote, "We approached a sofa which was near us, and to which the highly waxed parquet floor seemed maliciously, perhaps, to conduct us to our seats." End quote. One of the women, the same woman, claims at that moment, "The sofa is contagious. You can't approach it without feeling it." Of course, as over the top and ridiculous as some of this might sound, in the undercurrent of this approach to the sofa, the agency with which the sofa is invested, its active character as an inanimate thing, is precisely to take responsibility away from those who sit on it. As a result, the narrative that unfolds seems inevitable, prompted somehow not by the advance of the man, typically at least in libertine fiction, but as if this were the natural order of the material world. And with that, I will move us to other moving objects with Meredith Martin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to follow. Wait for the first image, please. Thank you. I'm really happy to follow David's presentation because the genre of the literary it narrative is one that has interested me for a long time. I even tried my hand at writing my own it narrative a few years ago for a book related to an exhibition that I co-curated on the 1720 Mississippi and South Sea bubbles, which brought about the world's first global financial crisis. I tried to personify a John Law banknote, which you see on the left, which was named after the Scottish gambler who had masterminded the financial scheme and who had persuaded the French government to print paper money for the first time on a large scale, thus precipitating the collapse. In preparing to write this text, I read a lot of 18th century it narratives, and I realized that many of them, in Europe at least, feature money as a protagonist, either a banknote, a coin, a guinea, a rupee, or some other currency that gets passed from hand to hand and makes its way around the world. For me, this underscores the point that it narratives are very much tied to the development of global capitalism, consumer culture, and their radical reordering of socioeconomic and psychic life, a process whereby things, or commodities like sofas or silk dressing gowns, began not only to express, but to speak for, or in some sense to even replace the self. Much of 18th century European art and philosophy, as Lynn Festa has explored in her wonderful book, Fiction Without Humanity, is profoundly concerned with the question of who or what counts as human, a question also related to the rise of a new market economy that redefined the relationship of person to property, as well as to the expansion of colonialism and the slave trade, which brutally reduced humans to the status of things. These developments haunt the boundaries of it narratives and related genres featuring inanimate objects that come to life, including fairy tales like Madame de Villeneuve's Beauty and the Beast. It was originally published within a larger frame narrative entitled The Young American and Sea Tales, involving a girl who sails from the French slave trading port of La Rochelle to the Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, to marry a plantation owner. Belle, the story's protagonist, likewise gets promised to a wealthy, if beastly, landowner, whom she must civilize or Frenchify, it's actually a period term, through love. In his exotic castle, she served colonial commodities like sugar and chocolate in porcelain cups that magically come to life and move of their own accord, arguably because the enslaved labor associated with them has been suppressed or erased. The tale offers a fascinating and disturbing meditation on precisely who gets to assume bodily form, to speak, to come to life, and to move of their own free will. Animated porcelain is a huge motif in early modern fairy tales and the performing arts, which are closely linked. And this makes sense in light of my earlier point because porcelain may be the first truly global commodity. The late 17th century writings of Madame d'Aulnoy, who is credited with coining the term fairy tale, are filled with porcelain palaces and figurines that come to life, as is the ballet Les Fêtes Chinoises, choreographed around 1750 by Nevers with sets by François Boucher. These productions had a long afterlife in a variety of media, including later tales like Hans Christian Andersen's The Shepherdess and the Chimney Sweep, which tells the story of two porcelain statuettes who try to escape their curio cabinet and are menaced by a Chinese pagode, a type of porcelain figure that I describe below, or in a minute. You also see porcelain come to life in Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty, based on Perrault's classic tale, and reimagined for the Ballet Russe in 1921, and of course in Disney's short film The China Shop, which is on view in Wolf's exhibition. All of these works are related in some way to a lost 18th century French ballet called the Teapot Prince, also known as the Ballet de Porcelain. Like Sleeping Beauty, it had been slumbering in a box in the archives for nearly 3 centuries until I heard about it from a good friend and managed to dig it up. Together with the choreographer Phil Chan, I've been working on a project to reimagine and restage this lost work, and thanks to Wolf and his colleagues, we were able to have our premiere at the Met last week. Written by the Comte de Caylus in 1739, 1 year before Beauty and the Beast, and incidentally, Madame de Villeneuve and Crébillon-Fils were both associated with the group who performed it. The ballet is based on a fairy tale that purports to tell the origins of pagodes, the same Chinese porcelain figures as Andersen's tale, which were popular among 18th century European collectors as well as porcelain manufacturers. You see one in the center here, made by Meissen around the same time as the ballet, and another perched atop a cabinet in a trade card engraved by Caylus for a well-known Parisian art dealer who renamed his entire shop after these coveted Asian wares. The ballet's story centers on a Chinese sorcerer who rules a blue island and has turned its inhabitants into porcelain. A prince and princess get stranded on the island, he's turned into a teapot, and she saves him by stealing the sorcerer's wand, breaking the spell, and bringing everyone back to life, except for the sorcerer himself, who is turned into a porcelain pagode. On the one hand, a conventional love story, the ballet is also an allegory for the European desire to know and possess the secrets of Asian porcelain manufacture, a kind of alchemical magic that the prince and princess attain while triumphing in the end and reducing their formidable Chinese opponent into a silly ornamental trinket. Virtually nothing survives of the ballet's original production, which was performed only twice, in 1739 and 1741, at a chateau outside of Paris. The owner of the chateau, the Comte de Morville, had been France's naval minister and oversaw trade policies with Asia, and his family were major collectors of Asian porcelain and other exotic goods, and it was most likely his son and daughter who danced the roles of the prince and princess. The Morville family had commissioned Watteau to design a Chinese cabinet for another one of their residences, and you see 2 surviving paintings from that room here on the bottom left. We know the ballet was performed at least once in the gardens of the chateau, next to a water feature surrounded by porcelain vases, and this print of a fête at Versailles may give some sense of what the original staging looked like. We can also look at related images from the time, like this print from a series representing artisans morphing into the tools of their trade to imagine the ballet's costumes. As for the choreography, it was not notated, like the dance that you see on the left, and it doesn't survive in any form. In our reimagined production, Phil Chan had to invent it entirely from scratch, partly by following cues from the libretto and from analogous performances of the time. Porcelain pagodes were a common feature of 18th century French ballets, and they were almost always danced in what was termed a grotesque mode, with acrobatic jumps and jerky movements that recalled the nodding figures they brought to life. The description of this costume for a 1700 performance at Versailles indicates that the legs that you see are fake, and that the dancer's actual legs were hidden inside the pedestal beneath him, attached to his body by suspenders, so that when he jumped up and down, the pedestal moved with him like a human jack-in-the-box. The description puts a new spin on all of the mounted porcelain pagodes that you see in the Met and other collections, and it gives a sense of how 18th century viewers might have imagined these figures rising up from their gilded cages and beginning to dance. Pagodes provided comic relief, but they also underscored their difference and inferiority relative to European elites, whose movements followed the more elegant, fluid, and symmetrical lines that you see in this dance notation. Over time, these pagode figures and their stereotypical movements became identified with Chinese characters in European ballet in ways that were seen as both pejorative and dehumanizing. And again, it underscores the point that not all forms of 18th century animation or anthropomorphism were the same, but sometimes carried cultural and racialized connotations that persist to this day. Obviously, in our reimagined production, we didn't want to perpetuate these stereotypes. Deconstructing them is, in fact, a huge part of Phil Chan's work through his organization, Final Bow for Yellowface. And so we recast our Chinese sorcerer as a mad European porcelain collector on the model of Augustus the Strong, founder of the Meissen manufactory. We also cast our prince and princess as 2 Asian American soloists from the New York City Ballet, Georgina Paz-Gauguin and Daniel Applebaum, who triumph over the European collector in the end and turn him into a pagode. Although we did this not so much to invert the power dynamics as to revive the perennial 18th century question of who and what counts as human. Who gets to be represented with humanity, with voice, with agency and nuance, in a way that makes this question relevant and meaningful for the present. Phil has likened our creative concept to kintsugi, a Japanese technique for repairing broken ceramics by mending them with gold or lacquer to highlight their flaws. In our production, we aim to celebrate the lost fragments and imperfections of this 18th century work by making them stronger and, we hope, even more beautiful with our modern additions. After the Met, we'll perform the ballet in several venues throughout the US and Europe, and our next stop is Chicago, where a related exhibition at the Smart Museum will explore how other contemporary artists, like the Korean sculptor Yi Suk-young, have engaged with kintsugi and other historical techniques to shed light on contemporary concerns. We hope that new insights will be gained with each new venue, and we encourage any and all of you to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you very much. I will now turn it over to Alicia Caticha for our final presentation.
I too would like to extend my thanks to Wolf and Sarah for inviting me to participate tonight and to see this wonderful exhibition. It is no exaggeration that 18th century France was collectively obsessed with the Greek myth of Pygmalion and Galatea. First recounted in Ovid's Metamorphoses, the myth tells the tale of Pygmalion, who fell so deeply in love with a statue of his own making that she was transformed from sculpture into a living, breathing woman. The myth became the subject of numerous plays, most famously Rousseau's Pygmalion, seen here in both imagined and amateur performances. It was also during the 18th century that Pygmalion's sculpture was at last given a name, Galatea, and she was transformed from ivory to the marble that we associate with her today. One sculptor in particular became known as the author of Pygmalion, and it's his legacy and commitment to sculptural animation that is felt so frequently throughout inspiring Walt Disney. That is the sculptor Etienne Maurice Falconet, who was the director of the sculpture atelier at Sèvres, the Sèvres porcelain manufactory, from 1757 to 1766. His porcelain statuette, the Magic Lantern, included in the exhibition, speaks to the literal history of animation as two children peek into a box where drawings illuminated by candlelight seem to come alive. Among the myriad of swinging scenes that inspired designs for Beauty and the Beast, and most recently Tangled and Frozen, Fragonard's The Swing features one of Falconet's most reproduced works, Menacing Cupid. Just barely in the frame, this Cupid, although a statue, becomes an active participant. Witnessing a secret liaison, he presses his fingers to his lips in a gesture that either warns the secret lovers to hide or promises his own discretion. He will not tell their secret. Falconet earned his moniker, author of Pygmalion, with the immediate success of his own version of the myth in 1763. Upon viewing the small marble group, the philosopher Denis Diderot imagined touching the statue and requested that his reader do the same, writing, quote, "How soft the flesh. No, it cannot be marble. Put a finger on it. The hardness of the material is gone. It will give beneath your touch," unquote. Falconet's 18th century audience would have immediately understood the intended goal here, to communicate the transition from marble to flesh using the very material the mythical Pygmalion used to carve Galatea. This is in deliberate contrast to painted representations of Galatea, in which her animation is signaled to us through chromatic means. As Galatea is infused with life, as seen here on the right, her flesh is hued pink. This is in deliberate contrast to her legs, which remain cold and lifeless. As Angela Rosenthal has brilliantly shown, white skin was not viewed in the 18th century as a singular color. Rather, white skin allowed for a translucency that revealed the rich tonalities of the blood flowing beneath the surface, the very same characteristics deployed in representations of Galatea. In Vivant Denon, 1777, libertine novella No Tomorrow, the object of the young male protagonist's desire, Madame T, is described as feeling nothing. She is made of marble. Later, however, the protagonist, having now been seduced by Madame T, admires her postcoital complexion, and I quote, "The color of her lips, more vivid than usual, set off the enamel of her teeth and made her smile more voluptuous. Red blushes, scattered here and there, set off the whiteness of her complexion and attested to its delicacy." The young protagonist quite literally takes on the role of Pygmalion, and Madame T becomes his Galatea through the rouging of her marble-like skin. In sculpture, however, one had to evoke this animation without, as Falconet himself described it, the seductive charm of color. The sculptor was not able to visualize the primary characteristic of white skin, the blush, through polychromatic means, and therefore had to rely on the manipulation of surface texture. No sculptor embraced this more than Falconet, whose penchant for small, delicate female nudes attempted to achieve this by conveying the softest of skin in the hardest of materials. And here we have a sampling of these statuettes in porcelain that would become synonymous with his name. The Met's own porcelain bather depicts a young woman dipping her foot into the imagined water beyond the threshold of the pedestal. Where she bends at her waist, her muscles seem to clench. In 1757, upon seeing the marble original of which the Met's porcelain is based, an anonymous critic in Mercure de France imagined her completing the step off the pedestal. This figure, he writes, seems to already feel, upon entering the bath, a light shiver from the cool water. Indeed, Falconet's bather inspired a proliferation of small-scale statuettes in marble and porcelain featuring female nudes that have only in the past 2 decades been reattributed to sculptors, including Tessert and the Broche brothers, Joseph and Jean-Baptiste. It is this conflation of marble and skin that these sculptors sought to emulate. A la Falconet, their female nudes universally feature slender bodies and small oval heads. In particular, Tessert's Venus speaks to the vested interest in sculptural animation. Details such as the tendon in her leg and her lower fleshy back evoke the characteristics praised by Falconet's admirers. It was this marble-flesh relationship that dominated the reception of Tessert's Venus at the Salon of 1769. One critic applauded the figure for its soft feeling of flesh, while another noted Tessert's delicate handling of the marble. These white nude statuettes proliferated throughout the domestic interiors of 18th century France, as evidenced by their ubiquitous presence in popular prints and watercolors, many which, as we can see here in the center image, tend towards the more libertine variety. Just as Falconet's menacing Cupid became an active participant in the swing, so too did these small statuettes, often taking up the role of observer, or more aptly, the role of voyeur. Their inclusion heightened the drama, often transforming more sexually ambiguous images of aristocratic life into those of a more libertine variety. This was a common trope in the 18th century. Even in Denon's novella No Tomorrow, which I mentioned earlier, the young protagonist reveals to us that upon seeing the interior of Madame T's home, quote, "It was no longer Madame T that I desired, it was her cabinet," unquote. A cabinet he later describes as including porcelain vases, gilded mirrors, and of course, small-scale statuettes. Nicolas Lavance's included Tassert's Venus in at least 2 of his paintings. In the love letter on the left, a woman discreetly passes a note to the harp player behind her. Tassert's small Venus watches over the scene on a pedestal, witnessing the letter exchange and making explicit its licentious contents. By contrast, in Scène Galante on the right, the Venus, now viewed from behind, has been transformed into a larger-than-life garden statue. Before her, an amorous couple sit on a bench. The female counterpart looks up towards her sculptural form, foreshadowing the outcome of the scene. In both, Tassert's Venus positions the viewer to understand the settings, the garden, the drawing room, as location for romantic encounters. Malet's The Meeting features what is perhaps the most explicit example of a statuette becoming an active participant, and even perhaps coming to life. In the watercolor, 2 women embrace while a third puts on her stockings. A small seated female nude is positioned above the commode behind the bed. The figure's composition evokes Broche's Bather, although it is notably painted in reverse. More significantly, however, the marble statue mirrors the pose of the seated woman, both crossing their right leg over their left and leaning their torso forward. The very conflation between woman and statue, between flesh and marble, that was central to Galatea's animation is now evoked through the domestic interior of 18th century France. The bather, acting as both participant and voyeur, makes explicit the watercolor's erotic undertones while simultaneously presenting us with an 18th century version of Galatea. In lieu of a conclusion, I will end with a quote from the 18th century art critic Martin Delacour. Writing in 1765, he expressed his disdain for these very watercolors and the statues included within them. Quote, "The most lascivious statues and paintings are the most esteemed. In how many homes are these works the only objects ornamenting cabinets and galleries? It is true that they are only statues, but those who view them are certainly not," unquote. Evoking the myth of Pygmalion and Galatea, he reminds his reader of the very seductive power of sculptural animation. Lascivious statues indeed.
Well, I would like to thank all of our speakers for their presentations. This was really wonderful and leaves us lots to talk about and not as much time as we would like to talk about it. But I am going to start with one question for all of you, which is, do you feel that the 18th century audience was more inclined to imaginatively animate the inanimate than in previous centuries? And if so, why would you say that might be the case?
Everybody's looking.
You're starting with a killer.
You were all just talking about this. I'm thinking, for example, so my field is the Italian Renaissance, and I think of the imagined conversations of Petrarch and Machiavelli with the great literary heroes with whom they want to have imagined discourse. So I'm struck in this 18th century discourse of yours that they are instead imaginatively having their dialogue with the inanimate decorative forms. I'm sure you can speak to this.
Go ahead.
I mean, I will just say yes really briefly, but I don't have a very interesting response because I do think that's the case, and I think it's primarily or largely related to the rise of capitalism and consumer culture and global trade, which includes the print market, which includes kind of authorship. Some of these authors of it narratives are worried that they themselves are being turned into kind of literary products. And so for sort of all of the reasons that I think I mentioned in my talk, I think it is more prevalent, and I think it's fundamentally different than in earlier eras.
I guess my answer would also be along the lines of a commodity culture, which is also simultaneously a public sphere shaped by a literary culture that's increasingly accessible, and therefore they kind of meld together in that way, reinforcing each other at different levels of society. So you can have a sub-object like behind us or something much less expensive.
And with that, I would just add that a culture of pleasure, which Wolf talked about, sort of encourages that. And not just pleasure, but also a really rich sense of humor. I think that as art historians, we are not prone to look for the comedic, and we like to make things serious, but the 18th century loves a good joke, and I think that the animation of forms falls right into that.
And I think that it's also a question of certain forms trickling down from the fine arts. So what we find in architecture and painting in the 16th and 17th century then does find its way into the design of furniture. If we look at Renaissance furniture, we may have the odd line head or lion's paw, but it doesn't, get into the design as it does then later on in the 18th century, where really the objects, through their design, are enlivened.
Final thought on that could also be that there might be a relationship and interest in the materials, which also has to do with your fact you're living with them as a commodity culture. But the reason for things like the encyclopedia, things like even the prints that you show, is this fascination with the actual process of making of certain things, certainly porcelain, but that inevitably kind of starts to break it down into trying to understand what it is as an object.
Well, and certainly philosophy too, materialist philosophy, which goes hand in hand with this fascination with materials and this kind of, dialogue between the animate and the inanimate, the relationship between humans and things, but also humans and animals, it becomes, I know this is a topic that's being discussed in the Renaissance, but I feel like the kind of sheer explosion of all of these philosophical debates plays a role too.
And in one delightful moment in Diderot's materialist philosophy that Meredith is referring to, he suggests eating Falconet's Pygmalion and Galatea to see that it will come alive. You just have to eat it.
This makes me think of one of my favorite drawings by Leonardo da Vinci, which shows a kind of stormy Tuscan landscape with all these household goods falling from the sky. And it's basically his kind of recognition of the sudden preponderance of objects to furnish the home that very much is the precedent for exactly this evolution you're talking about now. Did you want to jump in?
Well, I wanted to jump in as we're talking about, about objects, and one aspect that none of us have addressed, simply for lack of time, and your presentation was also rich in their own respect, is thinking about furniture and animating furniture. Is we haven't at all talked about sort of kinetic furniture and sort of automata, and thinking, for instance, as I was thinking about how certain forms trickle down from the fine arts into objects. We find that, for instance, in Röntgen furniture, where you press a button and suddenly the drawer jumps out, etc., which is something we don't have prior to the 18th century to that degree. And I wonder how you all think about how this whole idea of automata fits into the story. I mean, rather ironically, as I was walking through the exhibition today, we have one automaton which actually is, mounted in the case and sits still. It's the only object that actually, in theory, you could wind up and it would actually move into various directions. It's a James Cock's little chariot, which would, be amazing if it would be sort of moving, but we can't do that within the confines of the exhibition, whereas we have inanimate objects that really should be standing still, but we have rotated to really illustrate the dynamism of their design. But how do you think, as we're sort of thinking about how objects were actually literally animated in the 18th century, how that sort of fits into that story?
Well, I think speaking to this global consumerist culture that's developing, we also have to remember that these automata that are presenting often, for example, a woman playing piano, a duck eating and defecating, they were also going on tour, and they were going across Europe and being spectacles that people would pay to go see. Similar, I think, to the Falconet, the magic lantern, in that there's this culture of spectacle, this culture of performance that is now being engaged in the public sphere in a new way.
think also if we think about, I mean, I always try to think about the relationship between paintings, which people are less likely usually to animate on the whole, in part perhaps because they seem less like objects you can manipulate yourself. I think our visitors, certainly to the museum, that they don't have that inclination in the same way. I was imagining or thinking of the phenomenon of the mechanical paintings in the 18th century, which seems to suggest that they too were insufficient as a still thing. Of course, there are other things like shadow kind of puppet shows and this kind of thing, but to actually have a painting in a traditional frame that moves suggests that it was somehow failing to have that kind of animated sense that you're talking about.
But I think it speaks also to all these things that we love about the 18th century, the sense of pleasure, of jokes, of fun, of surprise, of, you know, not only like playing with the kind of boundary between like human and object, but also sort of testing people, observing these automata, like, is it going to make them blush? You know, and what's their reaction going to be?
Lots
How can
of
we kind of
blushes.
animate them in a different way? And I think it's really a challenge, and I'd love just to hear a little bit from you, Wolf, about this kind of. We've all drank the Kool-Aid on the 18th century. You know, it's magical, it's sexy. Porcelain, it's not something that people think a lot about, but it had this kind of, I mean, one of the reasons also why it gets animated, it becomes, it was thought to be alive, this kind of living, breathing material. And I know this was a challenge, but how do you feel like you attempted to kind of bring it to life in an exhibition for contemporary audience? I mean, you had the joy of working with Disney, which, you know, that's one answer, right? But
Well, yeah, that's one answer, and you know that in your raising the question about how do you animate those objects is putting it in dialogue with a tradition, a different type of animation, hand-drawn animation, and to draw a variety of parallels in the practice, the workshop practice of studios working together to create these unified works of art. But what I have noticed, I mean, the exhibition opened to the public on Friday, is going through the exhibition is that people are actually looking at those objects that we love so much, and albeit through that, you know, maybe through this through the Disney lens, or through the fact that they've want to see how those relate to one another, but they are really looking at very, very carefully. And I think one of the challenges of putting the exhibition together and selecting the objects is that we didn't want to have any repetition. We didn't also want to physically animate too much. I mean, there are 3 objects in the show that are on rotating platforms, and I felt quite strongly that, you know, this is something that one can do. It's something you do in a jewelry shop to make, you know, to illustrate that your diamond ring is really sparkly, and it works. And I think here, you know, I didn't want everything to rotate. I would have loved for the automata to sort of go up and down a hill, but that was too complicated. But to just sort of have 1 or 2 points where you can animate those objects and sort of highlight. And what's rather wonderful is with the Missonier candlestick, for instance, is that brings out the burnishing of the gilt bronze candlesticks, or the elements that we can't actually see when it's displayed in a case like that. You know, we might be able to look at it, you know, if Sarah and I go into the storerooms and handle it and hold it into light, etc., or if we, you know, put a candle in it and turn it on, then we will see that. But if it's sitting in a case normally, the visitor won't see that. And so that is actually really rather nice to be able to do that. It's all, you know, what is amazing, you know, seeing how the exhibition was put together physically over the course of 2.5 weeks is it's all in the lighting. I mean, the lighting makes such a huge difference in animating. It really is theater. It's really opera. It's dramatizing all these various elements. The sofa, I mean, there's no wonder people thought the sofa is walking through the exhibition. It is so alive. And we played around with the lighting quite a lot to try and dramatize that. Same is true of the mice and lion. It looks so much more dramatic the way it's lit. And we have the additional element of music, and I thought music was very important, also because a lot of the objects that you have shown would have been experienced with music. I mean, all the porcelain that would have been sitting on dining tables to try and enliven the whole atmosphere, this illusion of these objects coming to life, of you know, we have these mice and porcelain singers, had they sat on a table and you would have been listening to music at the same time, that heightens that illusion of animation. And I think it's really sort of the combination of all those elements that helped us enliven the collection that's under our care.
Well, I'm very sorry to say that we have reached our time, But I want to thank all of our speakers for sharing their scholarship with us and entering into this lively conversation. I want to thank the audience for joining us this evening, and I encourage all of you to hurry up and go see the Disney exhibition.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and congratulations.
Congratulations.